The name left his mouth before he could stop it. Alma. Patrick Carver said it, standing in the middle of Harlan Creek's one dirt road, his pack mule tugging at the lead rope in his fist, 50 pounds of salt blocks wrapped in burlap strapped to her back, and every single person in that small Colorado Territory town of 400 souls turning to stare at him like he had lost whatever good sense the mountains had left him. He said it again, quieter under his breath, the word dissolving between his lips like snowmelt, and he could not for the life of him explain why his chest had caved in like a mine shaft giving way beneath too much pressure. He had come to town for salt. That was it. That was the whole of his intention when he had descended from the high ridge above the Sangre de Cristo range that cold October morning in 1878, his beard thick with frost, his buckskin coat smelling of pine resin and wood smoke and solitude. He had run out of salt 2 weeks back, and a man living alone at altitude without salt was a man eating bland venison jerky and cursing his own forgetfulness every single evening. So he had come down. He had walked 12 miles. He had planned to be in and out of Harlan Creek in under an hour. No conversation, no lingering, no reason to speak to a single human soul beyond the proprietor of Beaumont's General Goods. Then Alma Aldridge had stepped out of the sheriff's office with a bruised blooming violet along her jaw like a storm cloud, a carpet bag clutched to her chest like it was the only thing left in the world that belonged to her, and the sheriff of Harlan Creek had said, loud enough for the whole street to hear, "You have got until sundown tomorrow, Miss Aldridge, and then the law of this county stands with Mr. Greer, and there is not a single thing I will be able to do for you." She had not cried. That was what had stopped Patrick Carver dead in his tracks. He had seen women cry in mining camps and trading posts and the occasional frontier town, and he had learned to keep walking, because other people's heartbreak was none of his business, and he had chosen this solitary life on the mountain for precisely that reason. But Alma Aldridge had looked at the sheriff with eyes the color of dark amber, had squared her shoulders inside a threadbare calico dress that was 2 sizes too big, and had said, "Then I suppose the law of this county had better get used to disappointment." And then she had walked straight toward him, because he was standing directly in her path, and she had looked up at him, all 5 feet and 4 inches of her facing down 6 feet and 3 inches of him, and she had said, "Are you going to move, sir? Or are you planning to stand in the road until the ground freezes around your boots?" He had moved, but he had not stopped thinking about her name. Let him go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters, and it matters in the way that only things do when they are quietly building towards something that will eventually change a person so completely that they cannot remember who they were before. Patrick Carver was 34 years old in October of 1878. And he had been living alone on a ledge of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains for 6 years. Before that, he had been a soldier in the Union Army during the tail end of the war, had come home to find his family's farm in Missouri mortgaged past saving, had tried his hand at cattle driving for 2 seasons, and had then, in the summer of 1872, decided that he was done with people altogether. Not out of hatred. Out of exhaustion. He had seen too many men make promises they did not keep, had watched too much cruelty dressed up as righteousness, and had simply reached the conclusion that the mountains were honest in a way that men were not. He had built his cabin himself with timber he felled and squared. He had learned to trap and hunt and preserve. He had traded furs twice a year at Harlan Creek and spoken no more than 50 words on each occasion. He had read the same 3 books until the spines gave out. He was not a miserable man. He was a quiet one, which was different, and he had confused the 2 long enough that he had mostly stopped examining the distinction. He was examining it now, standing in front of Beaumont's General Goods, because Alma Aldridge had gone into the boarding house across the road and the door had closed behind her, and he was standing here with 50 pounds of salt and the uncomfortable sensation that something had just shifted in the world, small and tectonic at once, like the first crack in a frozen river. Ezra Beaumont was a round man with a waxed mustache, and the good sense not to ask too many questions of the men who came down from the high country. He counted out Patrick's salt blocks, took his first scrip, and added a small bag of ground coffee and a paper of pins without being asked, because he had been doing this for 6 years and he knew Patrick's list by heart. "Trouble with the Aldridge woman," Ezra said, not as a question. "I don't know anything about it," Patrick said. "Course you don't. You just got here." Ezra wrapped the coffee in brown paper and tied it with twine. "She came to town 3 weeks ago. Schoolteacher. Hired by the Harlan Creek Council to run the schoolhouse they finished building in August. Except Calhoun Greer owns the land the schoolhouse sits on, and he says the deed the council thought they had is fraudulent, and he wants the building taken down or bought out at a price nobody in this town can afford, and he's been making Miss Aldridge's life very difficult in the meantime, because Calhoun Greer is the kind of man who makes everything difficult for everyone who stands between him and what he wants." Patrick picked up his packages. "That's a county matter." "It is," Ezra agreed. "Except the county sheriff is Calhoun Greer's wife's brother, so you can imagine how the county feels about it." Patrick looked at the door of the boarding house across the road. "He's got a real gift for teaching," Ezra said, almost to himself, straightening a row of tins on the shelf behind the counter. 12 children in that schoolhouse. First school this town has ever had. Mrs. Beaumont says the children talk about Miss Aldridge like she hung the moon herself. Patrick thought about the way Alma Aldridge had looked at the sheriff, the way she had not cried. "When's sundown tomorrow?" he asked. Ezra looked at him with considerable interest. "Same time it always is," he said carefully. "Around 5 o'clock this time of year." Patrick set his packages back down on the counter. "Tell me about this Calhoun Greer," he said. Ezra Beaumont did not smile, but his mustache did something complicated. "Well now," he said, "let me put on the kettle." Calhoun Greer was 48 years old, and he had come to the Colorado Territory in 1865 with money from his family's Georgia plantation, and the absolute conviction that the frontier was a place where a man of capital could simply purchase whatever he wanted and call it civilization. He owned the mill, the feed lot, 2 of the 3 saloons, several parcels of land around the town's perimeter, and through his brother-in-law the sheriff, a significant portion of local law enforcement. He was not a stupid man. He was a strategic one, which was more dangerous, because stupid men made visible mistakes and strategic men dressed their greed up in legal language until it was almost unrecognizable. The fraudulent deed issue was real as far as it went. The town council had purchased a lot from a man named Ferris Dunn who had, it emerged later, not had clear title to sell. Calhoun Greer had purchased that title afterward quietly from the Territory Land Office and now held it legitimately. He wanted either a substantial sum from the council or the removal of the schoolhouse. He had begun pressuring Alma Aldridge directly when he discovered she was not the sort of woman to be quietly intimidated, and the bruise on her jaw was the result of his hired man, a fellow named Durant, getting considerably more direct than Greer himself would ever be caught being. Patrick sat in the boarding house's small parlor, because Ezra Beaumont had sent his wife across the road to ask Miss Aldridge if she would speak with someone who might be willing to help. And Alma Aldridge had said she would speak with anyone who had a legitimate idea rather than more expressions of sympathy, which she had plenty of already. She came downstairs in a clean shirtwaist and dark skirt, her brown hair pinned back, the bruise on her jaw now more vivid in the lamplight than it had been in the afternoon sun. She was 26 years old, Patrick would learn later. She had come from Kansas, where she had trained as a teacher. Her parents were dead. She had a sister in Ohio who was married and settled. She had taken the Harlan Creek position because it was one of the few places in the territory offering a schoolteacher's wage to a woman without a husband, and because she had believed, perhaps naively, that a town that wanted a school wanted what schools were for. She sat down across the small parlor table from him without ceremony and looked at him with those dark amber eyes that had a quality of assessment in them so direct it was almost physical. "Mrs. Beaumont says you came down from the mountain," she said. "I did." And you want to help. I'm thinking about it, he said honestly. Something in her expression sharpened. Not suspicion exactly, but precision, the way a person looked when they were measuring the distance between what they hoped and what they actually had. That's more truthful than most men have been with me this week, she said. What do you know about land disputes? Not much, Patrick admitted. But I know about Calhoun Greer's kind. I've seen men like him in 3 different territories. They count on the people they're pressuring being alone. I am alone. You don't have to be. She looked at him for a long time. The fire in the parlor grate crackled and settled. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the first cold teeth of a real autumn storm down from the higher elevations. Patrick sat very still, the way he had learned to sit in the mountains when something wild was deciding whether to trust him. Your name, she said finally, Patrick Carver. What do you do on that mountain, Patrick Carver? I trap, I hunt. I read when I have candles, I think. What do you think about? He had not expected that question, and he did not have an automatic answer for it, which surprised him, because he had been alone for 6 years and had imagined himself to be the most self-aware man in the territory. Things that matter, he said, which was both honest and evasive, and she seemed to know it. The school matters, she said. Those 12 children have never had a proper education before. 2 of them can already read whole sentences. One little girl, Marisol, her father is a miner from Mexico, and she translates for him at the assay office because she's the only one in her family who knows enough English, and she's 8 years old, and I will not watch what she's building inside herself get taken away because a man who already has more than he can use wants one more thing. Patrick felt something move in his chest that he did not have a clean name for. Not pity, not admiration exactly, though it was close to that. It was more like recognition, the feeling of seeing something true. Tell me exactly what Greer wants and what the council has tried, he said. She told him. She was organized and precise. She had documented everything. Dates, amounts, conversations, the specific legal language of the fraudulent deed, what she understood about the territory land office's process. She had written letters to the territory governor's office, which had not yet been answered. She had spoken to a lawyer in Pueblo who had agreed that Greer's claim was legally sound but morally bankrupt, and had offered to pursue the case for a fee that the town council simply did not have. She had, over the past 3 weeks, essentially been running a one-woman legal and civic campaign, while simultaneously teaching school every morning, and trying not to let the children see that their teacher was afraid. The bruise on her jaw was from yesterday afternoon, when Durant had come to the schoolhouse after hours to deliver Greer's latest message, which was that the school would be shuttered by end of week whether she cooperated or not, and that things would go easier for her if she packed her bags quietly. She had told Durant to get off school property and had attempted to close the door, and Durant had put his hand against the door, and then his hand had made contact with her face, and Alma Aldridge had picked up the fire poker and given Durant a reason to leave with considerable speed. You hit him with a fire poker? Patrick asked. Across the shoulders, she said, with a composure that was magnificent and slightly terrifying. I was aiming for his hand, but he moved. Patrick was quiet for a moment. Do you know if Greer has the original purchase agreement between the council and Dunn? No, the council has their copy. Does Greer know about the lawyer in Pueblo? I don't know what Greer knows, Patrick thought. He was not a lawyer, and he was not a politician, and he was not a particularly social man. But he had spent 6 years in country that gave you time to think, real thinking, the kind without interruption. And what he was thinking now was that Calhoun Greer's entire strategy depended on isolation. Alma Aldridge being alone, the council being outspent, the situation never reaching anyone outside this valley who might care about it. The territory governor's office, Patrick said. Your letter, when did you send it? 6 days ago. Pony Express from here goes through twice a week. So it's arrived, Patrick said, but government offices don't move fast. No, she agreed. But newspapers do, Patrick said. Is there a newspaper man in Pueblo? She looked at him. The Rocky Mountain News has a correspondent in Pueblo. I read it sometimes. A man named Hargrove. Write him a letter tonight, Patrick said. Everything you told me, the children's names. Marisol translating at the assay office. The bruise on your jaw and who put it there. The fraudulent deed and Greer's relationship to the county sheriff. Newspapers live for exactly this kind of story, and Calhoun Greer lives for being the kind of man who important people think well of. Publicity is the one thing men like him cannot buy their way out of. Alma Aldridge looked at him with an expression he would later come to know as her thinking face, the slight compression of her lips, the way her eyes went inward for a moment before returning to the surface of the world. That might work, she said slowly. That might genuinely work, but it takes time, and I have until sundown tomorrow. Then we need to buy you time, Patrick said, and for that I need to talk to Greer directly. Why would he talk to you? Because I'm going to give him something he wants more than the school, she frowned. What could you possibly have that? First script from 6 years of mountain trapping is worth more than you might think, Patrick said. And I know where there's a mineral deposit 3 ridges up from here that a man like Greer would find very interesting. Alma stared at him. You would trade that information for time. I would trade it for a legal postponement, signed and witnessed, giving the council 60 days to resolve the deed issue through proper territory channels. He met her eyes, which is long enough for a letter to reach Hargrove and long enough for the governor's office to feel the pressure of a newspaper story. That's your money, she said. Your security. You don't owe this town anything. No, Patrick agreed. I don't. The fire crackled. She looked at him with the same measuring quality she had shown when she first sat down, except now there was something underneath it that was different. Something warmer and more cautious at once, the way people looked when they were being offered something real and were not entirely sure they should believe in it. Why? She asked. He did not have a clean answer for that either. What he knew was that he had come to town for salt and had been stopped in his tracks by a woman who did not cry when she had every reason to, and that the word she had said to the sheriff, disappointment, had hit him somewhere underneath his ribs and was still sitting there. He knew that Marisol translating at the assay office because she was 8 years old and already understood that knowledge was the only thing no one could take from you, had hit him in a completely different place. He knew that he had spent 6 years being honest about everything except whether solitude was actually what he wanted, and that perhaps what he wanted was a reason. Because it's the right thing, he said, which was true, and because I don't want to go back up the mountain yet, which was also true, and he left it at that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "All right, Patrick Carver, let us make a plan." She said his name like it was a complete sentence. He noticed that. He noticed it more than was reasonable. The next morning came in cold and clear, the kind of Colorado autumn day that had pure blue sky above and knife-edge air, and Patrick Carver walked to Calhoun Greer's house, which was the largest in Harlan Creek, and sat behind an iron fence at the north end of town, announcing itself as the home of a man who wanted you to know what he had. Greer received him in a study that smelled of cigar smoke and leather. He was a big man going soft at the middle, silver-haired, with the particular kind of watchful stillness that belonged to men who had learned that showing their thinking cost them advantage. He looked at Patrick the way men like him looked at men who came down from the mountains, with a practiced condescension that was not quite contempt. "Mr. Carver," he said, "Ezra Beaumont said you had something to discuss." Patrick did not sit down when offered. He stood, because in his experience with men like Greer, height was a language they understood. "I'll be brief," he said. "I know about the mineral deposit on the high ridge above Cottonwood Creek. 3 ridges northeast of the Sangre de Cristo trailhead. Iron and copper, possibly silver. I've been looking at it for 2 years. Greer's stillness changed quality. Almost imperceptible, but Patrick was a man who read small changes in living things. "Go on," Greer said. "I'll give you the exact location, a written description of what I've found, and my honest assessment of what a proper survey would show," Patrick said. "In exchange, You sign a 60-day postponement on the school property claim, properly witnessed, giving the council time to pursue resolution through the Territory Land Office. And if the Territory Land Office finds in my favor, then you get the school, Patrick said, fair and square by law, and you still have the mineral deposit information. Greer studied him. Why would you do this for a schoolteacher you don't know? Because I have the information and it's not doing me any good on the mountain, Patrick said, and because I'd rather see this settled by law than by your man Durant putting his hands on women. Something shifted in Greer's face at Durant's name. Not guilt. Patrick didn't think Greer had that particular equipment, but calculation. Durant had become a liability. The bruise on Alma Aldridge's jaw was a story with legs. Durant acted without my instruction, Greer said. I'm sure he did, Patrick said, and left the sarcasm so thin it was almost invisible. Greer agreed to the postponement. Patrick had expected this, because Greer was strategic and the mineral deposit was real, and 60 days was not a forever commitment to a man who was confident in his legal position. The document was drawn up by noon, signed by Greer and witnessed by the notary public who operated out of the back of the land office, and Patrick walked it across to the boarding house where Alma Aldridge read every word of it twice with her eyes moving carefully over each line. This is real, she said. It's real. She looked up at him. The mineral deposit, was that something you were saving? Not exactly, but it had value to you. Everything has some value, Patrick said. Some things have more. She looked at him again with that amber-eyed precision, and this time there was something in her expression that made the air in the small boarding house parlor feel different, charged at the edges, like the air before a lightning strike. I will pay you back, she said. I don't know how or when, but I will. I'm not keeping a ledger, he said. I am, she said quietly. He had intended to leave that afternoon. He had his salt, he had his coffee, he had given up the mineral deposit information, and there was nothing more to be done here except wait for letters to travel and newspapers to decide what was worth printing. He had a mountain to go back to. He didn't leave. He told himself it was because the storm that had been building the night before had not materialized, and the next one was likely worse, and descending in a mountain storm was genuinely dangerous. He told himself it was because he wanted to see how the Greer matter resolved. He told himself several other things that were partially true, and he knew it. What was completely true was that he had dinner at the boarding house table that evening, and Alma Aldridge sat across from him, and they talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with the school or Calhoun Greer. She had read extensively, more than he had expected, and more than he had managed even with 6 years of winter evenings. She had opinions about history and about the nature of education, and about the question of whether the frontier was something to be civilized or something to be understood, and her opinions were not soft. She argued with him when she disagreed, which happened twice, and she was right once, and he conceded it directly, and she looked at him with something that might have been surprise. Most men don't do that, she said. Do what? Say they were wrong. Most men are wrong more often than they think, Patrick said. She laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, not the practiced social laugh he had heard from women in trading posts and supply stores, but the real kind, the kind that escaped before the person decides whether to let it out. He stored it somewhere. The days passed. Patrick found reasons, legitimate ones, to stay. He helped Ezra Beaumont repair the roof of the general store, which had been leaking since August and which Ezra had been putting off because his back was troubling him. He split wood for the boarding house. He made himself quietly useful in the way he had once made himself quietly useful in the army, without announcement, moving through tasks with the particular competence of a man who had spent 6 years keeping himself alive in conditions that did not forgive sloppiness. He went to the school. He hadn't planned to. He had been walking past on his way to help a rancher named Torres, whose fence line had come down in a wind, and he had heard the sound of children's voices inside the low wooden building, and then he had heard Alma Aldridge's voice, clear and warm and completely different from the way she spoke to adults, carrying inside it a kind of patience that was also a kind of passion, and he had stopped. Through the schoolhouse window he could see 12 children in rows, and Alma standing at the board she had chalked sentences on, and a small girl in the front row who must have been Marisol, with dark braids and extremely attentive eyes, who was reading aloud with the concentrated care of someone who knew that reading was not simple, that it was a door, and that doors led places. Patrick stood there longer than he intended. When school let out he was still there, having decided by then that he was there, so he might as well be useful, and the children filed past him with the frank curiosity of children who had not yet learned to pretend they weren't looking. Marisol stopped and looked up at him. "You're very tall," she said, in English that was careful and deliberate. "I am," he agreed. "My father says tall men see weather first," she said, and went to find her coat. Alma came to the door and saw him. She looked at him for a moment the way she had been looking at him increasingly, with a quality that was not guarded but careful, like she was still taking measurements that she had not yet finished. "Did you need something?" she asked. "I heard you teaching," he said honestly. She leaned against the door frame. And I thought a woman who could make a room full of children understand something was something worth watching," he said. The color came up in her cheeks. Not a blush exactly, more a deepening, like sunlight moving on red earth. She looked at him for a moment and then she said, with a deliberate return to practicality, "Come in. There's still warmth from the stove. I need to grade these papers and it will take an hour, but you're welcome to sit if you want to be out of the wind." He sat. He watched her grade papers with the same focused precision she brought to everything, making small notes in the margins, occasionally making a sound that was either approval or gentle correction. The schoolroom smelled of chalk and sawdust and the iron stove. Outside the wind was pushing hard. He did not need to be there. He was there. "Tell me about the mountain," she said, without looking up from the papers. So he told her. He told her about the first winter, which had been the hardest and also, strangely, the most clarifying. He told her about the moment in the second spring when he had understood the difference between loneliness and solitude and realized he was in danger of confusing them permanently. He told her about the way the high country looked on a clear night in January when the stars were close enough to seem architectural, as though the sky was a structure built by something that loved precision. He told her about the elk that had walked through his camp every spring morning for 3 years, the same one he could identify by the particular gait of her left hind leg, and how the year she stopped coming he had felt something he did not have words for. Alma had stopped pretending to grade papers. She was listening with her full face, the way she listened, not politely but completely. "That sounds like grief," she said, "when the elk stopped coming." "Maybe," he said. "I didn't call it that." "What did you call it?" "I called it noticing an absence," he said, "which is what grief is, I suppose." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother died when I was 19. My father 2 years later. I called it everything except what it was for a long time because naming it felt like it would make it too large to live beside." "Does naming it help?" he asked. "Eventually," she said. "Not immediately. Immediately it just hurts more." The stove ticked in the quiet. Outside, the first real snowflakes of the season began to fall, visible through the schoolhouse's single glass window, drifting and white. "Why a schoolteacher?" he asked. "Because I wanted to give children the thing I had," she said simply. "My mother was educated. She read to me every evening before I could read myself. She told me that what was in your head was yours, that no one could foreclose on it or repossess it or burn it down. I believed her. I still believe her. I want 12 children in this valley to know it too." Patrick thought about that. He thought about his own schooling, which had been limited and practical, and about the winter evenings on the mountain with his 3 worn books, and about how the things he had read had kept him company in a way that was not nothing. Knowledge as property. The most portable kind. A letter arrived from Hargrove at the Rocky Mountain News 11 days after Alma sent it. He was interested, very interested. He was planning to visit Harlan Creek personally in 2 weeks. The story of a town school being shut down by a land deal corruption, a bruised teacher, and a county sheriff with a conflict of interest was precisely the kind of story that the Denver readership wanted in the autumn of 1878, when the question of how the Colorado Territory was being governed was a live political question. Alma read the letter aloud to Patrick in the boarding house parlor with her voice doing something he had never heard in it before, a quality that was neither triumph nor relief exactly, but the sound of a person who has been holding something up alone for a very long time and has just felt another pair of hands come alongside. When she finished reading, she looked up at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her say quietly, "This was your doing. Your letter did it," he said. "Your idea," she said. "Your words," he said. She put the letter down on the table between them and looked at him with an expression he could not fully read, which was unusual, because he had spent 6 years reading things that could not speak, and he had become good at it. There was gratitude in it, yes, and something warm and cautious and possibly frightened, not of him. He didn't think, but of what the warmth meant and where it went if she followed it. He knew the feeling exactly. "Patrick," she said. "Yes. I need to ask you something that might be impertinent." "Ask. Are you staying because of the Greer situation?" she said carefully, "or are you staying for some other reason?" The question sat between them like a live thing. He looked at her. "Both," he said, because lying to her felt impossible and evasion felt dishonest, and she had asked him directly, which was the kind of thing she did, and which was one of the things about her he had no defense against. The color came up in her face again. She looked down at the letter for a moment, then back up at him, and she said, "I see," in a voice that was completely level, and then she said, "Then I will tell you that I am not a woman who behaves foolishly about these things." "I know that," he said, "and I am not in a position to afford to. I know that too." "But," she said, and then she stopped, and he waited, because he had learned that patience with wild things was its own kind of language. "I find that I am glad you stayed." He said nothing for a moment because nothing seemed adequate. Then he said, "Alma," just her name, and she closed her eyes for a single second like someone receiving something they had not let themselves expect, and then she opened them again and picked up the letter and said briskly, "We should think about what to tell Hargrove when he arrives." They thought about it together for another 2 hours, and neither of them said anything else that was personal, and the air between them had changed completely, and they both knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. Hargrove arrived 2 weeks later, a small, energetic man with ink-stained fingers and a habit of writing things down while you talked to him, which some people found rude and which Patrick found entirely sensible. He spent 2 days in Harlan Creek. He interviewed Alma at length. He interviewed the school council. He interviewed Ezra Beaumont. He spoke briefly and carefully to Marisol's father, Diego Torres, with Marisol translating, and afterward he put his pencil down for a moment and looked at the 8-year-old girl doing the work of a professional interpreter with complete composure, and he said quietly to Patrick, who was present, "This is the story. This girl is the story." "I know," Patrick said. The article ran in the Rocky Mountain News 17 days later. It was lengthy and specific, and it named Calhoun Greer and his brother-in-law the sheriff and Durant explicitly. It named Marisol Torres. It quoted Alma Aldridge in full, including the thing she had said to Hargrove about her mother telling her that what was in your head was yours. The headline was not gentle. Within a week, the governor's office had sent a letter acknowledging receipt of Alma's earlier correspondence, and indicating that the Territory Land Commissioner would be reviewing the deed situation personally. Within 2 weeks, Calhoun Greer's lawyer had indicated to the town council's newly engaged lawyer, who was willing to take the case on contingency following the newspaper coverage, that Mr. Greer was open to a negotiated resolution. Within 30 days of the article's publication, the deal was done. The land under the schoolhouse was sold to the Harlan Creek Town Council at the original assessed value, which was a fraction of what Greer had been demanding, and the school stayed. Alma Aldridge stood in the schoolroom when the final papers were signed and looked around at the wooden desks and the chalkboard and the iron stove and said nothing for a long moment. Patrick stood in the doorway. She turned and looked at him and she said, "It worked." "It did," he said. "Patrick." She crossed the room toward him and he was not sure what was going to happen, and then she did something he had not anticipated. She took his hand. Just that, both of her hands around one of his, which was large and rough and not accustomed to being held, and she held it and she said, "Thank you. I mean that in a way I don't have enough words for." His hand felt like it was on fire. "You did the work," he said. "We did it," she said, gently correcting him. They stood like that for a moment in the schoolhouse where 12 children would come tomorrow and learn things that were theirs forever. And Patrick Carver, who had come to town for salt, understood with perfect clarity that he was not going back up the mountain. The problem was that he was not sure what the alternative looked like. He and Alma had fallen into an easiness of company that was both comfortable and electric, which was a combination he had not known existed before. They ate together most evenings. They walked together sometimes in the late afternoon when school was out, following the creek north of town where the cottonwoods were dropping their leaves in yellow showers, talking about everything and specifically nothing. He helped her repair a broken desk in the schoolroom. She taught him a card game she had learned from her father that involved considerable strategy, and which he lost 3 times before he understood it and won, after which she claimed she had let him win, and he pointed out that she was a terrible liar, and she laughed again, that escaped genuine laugh. He had catalogued a significant number of her laughs by this point. There was the one that surprised her. There was the quiet one that was mostly in her eyes. There was the one that came with exasperation when he said something that was technically correct but deliberately unhelpful. He had never catalogued anything about a person before. He found he did not want to stop. One evening in late November, walking back from the creek in early dark with frost beginning on the ground, she said, "What are you going to do?" "About what?" "About the mountain," she said, with a patience that suggested she was not fooled by the question. He was quiet for a moment, their breath coming in small clouds, the first stars appearing in the immense Colorado sky overhead. "I had a life up there," he said, "that I built, deliberately." "I know," she said. "It wasn't nothing," he said. "I know that too," she said. "I'm not asking you to say it was." He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He turned to look at her and she was looking at him already, because that was how she was. She did not wait for permission to look at things directly. And in the starlight her eyes were dark and her breath was a small cloud between them, and he thought that he had been alone for 6 years because he had believed solitude was preferable to the complication of being known by someone, and that he had been wrong. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Living in a town, being around people. I left for reasons." "I know," she said for the 3rd time, and then she said, "I'm not asking you to be something you're not. I'm only asking if you want to be here." "I want to be where you are," he said, which was the most direct thing he had said in 6 years and possibly in his entire adult life, and his voice was lower than usual because the words had weight. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took a step toward him, which put her close, very close, and she put her hand against his jaw, which was rough with beard and cold with the air, and she said, "Then stay." He kissed her. He had not kissed a woman in a very long time, and he was not sure he would remember how. But it turned out that some things were remembered in the body regardless of time, and what he had forgotten was made up for by the fact that Alma Aldridge kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, without hesitation, her hands against his face, and the frost was on the ground and the stars were overhead, and he thought that the mountain would always be there if he needed it. But this was something that did not repeat. When they separated, she was looking at him with her eyes very bright and her breath unsteady, and she said, "Well, yes," he agreed. "That was," she said, and seemed to lose the end of the sentence. "Yes," he said again. She laughed, the surprised one, and tucked her arm through his as they walked back to town, and the name he could not stop saying was full inside him now, warm and insistent, Alma, 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 like a compass direction, like the name of a place he had been trying to find for 6 years without knowing he was looking. November gave way to December. The snow came in earnest, blanketing Harlan Creek in the particular white quiet that Patrick knew from the mountain, and which felt entirely different in a town, softer somehow, because it covered the world but there were lights in windows. He had taken a room at a boarding house on the western edge of town, not the same one Alma was at, because propriety in 1878 was a practical consideration, and Alma was the town's schoolteacher, and her reputation was her livelihood, and he understood this and respected it completely. But he was there in Harlan Creek, and every day she was there too, and the distance between them was something they both felt and navigated with care. On a Sunday in December, he walked to the schoolhouse and found her there, even though it was not a school day. She was adding drawings to the walls, illustrations from a book she had sent away for, maps and diagrams of the natural world, geology and botany and the shapes of weather systems. She was standing on a chair to reach the upper portion of the wall, and when she heard him come in she said, without turning around, "The bird drawing goes in the corner." "I don't have a bird drawing," he said. She turned around and nearly fell off the chair, and he crossed the room in 2 steps and had his hands on her waist before she tipped, and she caught his shoulders, and for a moment they were very close again, her hands on his shoulders and his hands on her waist, the chair precarious beneath her. "Thank you," she said, rather breathlessly, making no immediate effort to put distance between them. "You should be more careful," he said, making no immediate effort to step back. "You should be less startling," she said. He lifted her down from the chair, which was easier than she expected, and when her feet touched the floor she was still holding his shoulders and he was still holding her waist, and the schoolhouse was quiet and snowy light came through the window, and she said, "Patrick." "Yes." "I would like to ask you something else that may be impertinent." "You've already established that you do that," he said. "I do," she agreed. She looked up at him. "Are you intending to court me properly? Because I would like to know, because I am not built for uncertainty, and I find that I am already considerably invested in whatever this is, and I would rather know where I stand than guess." He held her gaze. "Alma," he said, "I came to town for salt. I have not once thought about going back to the mountain without you. I think that answers your question." She looked at him for a long, considering moment. Then she said, "It does." And she went up on her toes and kissed him, brief and deliberate, and then stepped back and picked up her illustration and said, "Now, will you hold the ladder while I put this in the corner?" He held the ladder. He did not stop smiling for the rest of the afternoon. He could not remember the last time he had smiled for that long without stopping. Christmas came to Harlan Creek, the way Christmas came to frontier towns in 1878, with a pine tree in the church, community singing, and the trading post offering a small supply of hard candy from the east that sold out in 40 minutes. Ezra Beaumont organized a town supper in the livery stable, cleared out and decorated with paper chains that Patrick was fairly sure the children had made at school, and the whole town came because in a town of 400, the whole town usually did. Patrick sat beside Alma at the long table, and her hand found his under the table for a moment during the singing, just briefly, and he thought about how completely his life had changed in the span of 8 weeks, and how, if someone had told him in September that he would be sitting in a lit livery stable in the Colorado Territory holding a schoolteacher's hand while people around him sang hymns and ate venison stew, he would have thought the description sounded unbearable. He could not understand now why. Marisol Torres was at the table with her family, her father Diego, a quiet man with calloused hands who looked at Patrick once over the course of the evening, with an expression that was careful and assessing, and Patrick thought, eventually approving, in the way of a man who had learned that trust was a thing to be earned in small portions. Marisol herself had brought something from school to show Alma, a composition she had written, 3 full paragraphs in English about what she wanted to be when she grew up, which was, she had written with the specific confidence of an 8-year-old who had decided something, a doctor. Because she had written, She wanted to help people with her knowledge the way Miss Aldridge helped people with hers. Alma read it twice and then told Marisol it was the best thing she had read in a long time, and meant it. And Patrick watched Marisol's father look at his daughter with an expression that had nothing complicated in it at all, just pure, uncomplicated love, and he looked at Alma and thought, yes. In January, Patrick began talking to Ezra Beaumont about the possibility of trapping and trading locally rather than from the mountain. The country around Harlan Creek was not the high ridge, but it was productive, and he knew it now reasonably well. He also discovered, somewhat to his own surprise, that he had skills that were useful in a town. He could build, he could fix. He understood machinery in the practical way of someone who had maintained everything he depended on without help. The rancher Torres hired him for the winter to help shore up structures on his land that had been weakened by a summer flood. The work was straightforward and physical, and Patrick was good at it. He began to build something, not a house, not yet, but the shape of a life in Harlan Creek that included Alma at its center. In late January, on a cold, clear evening, he asked her to marry him. He had thought about how to do this for approximately 3 weeks, because he was not a man who did things by impulse or without preparation, and he had arrived at the conclusion that the most honest way to do it was simply to say what was true, without ceremony or elaborate staging, because Alma Aldridge was a woman who valued truth over performance. He said it in the schoolhouse, which seemed right because that was where she was most completely herself. He said, "I have been thinking about what I want my life to look like from here forward. I have been thinking about it with more seriousness than I have thought about anything in a long time, and what I want is for you to be in it. Not as a visitor to my solitude, as the reason my solitude is over. I want to marry you, Alma, if you want that too." She was quiet for a moment that felt very long. Then she said, "I wanted it approximately 3 weeks into knowing you, and I have been trying to be sensible about it ever since." "Were you successful?" he asked. "Not remotely," she said, and she took his hands in both of hers and looked up at him and said, "Yes, Patrick, yes, I want that too." They were married in March of 1879 in the Harlan Creek Church by a circuit preacher who came through twice a season. Ezra and his wife were there. The Torres family were there, Marisol in a dress with a wide collar, standing very straight. The 12 schoolchildren came, at Alma's request, because she said the school was her community and she wanted them there, and their parents came with them, and the small church was fuller than it had been for a wedding in years. Alma wore a dress she had made herself from fabric Ezra Beaumont had ordered from Denver, blue-gray wool with small white buttons, and her brown hair was down and pinned with 2 combs, and she looked at Patrick when she walked in with the expression she wore when she had decided something completely. No more calculation, just settled certainty, and he thought he had never seen anything so clear in his life. The preacher read the words. Patrick said his clearly, without stumbling, because he had meant them before he said them, and meaning them made the saying simple. Alma said hers looking directly at him the whole time, not down at her hands, not at the congregation, at him, because that was how she did everything. When it was done, Marisol, who apparently had views about what weddings required, produced a handful of dried flowers from somewhere and threw them upward with tremendous enthusiasm, and most of the children followed her example with whatever they had available, and there were dried grass and small pebbles, and at least one slightly startled bird feather in the air, and Patrick laughed, genuinely and completely, and Alma was already laughing, and the church was full of the sound of it. They took a house on the east side of Harlan Creek, a 2-room structure that Patrick expanded over the course of the spring into 3 rooms with a proper kitchen and a front porch that faced east so they could see the mountains from it. Alma continued teaching. Patrick continued his trapping work and his building work for tours, and added to it, because word had gotten around that Patrick Carver had the kind of practical skills that a growing town needed, and there was always something to be repaired or built or reinforced. The town itself was changing. The newspaper article had done something besides resolve the school dispute. It had put Harlan Creek on the map as a community of a certain character, the kind that fought for what it believed in, and that attracted people who valued that. New families came through the spring and summer of 1879. A doctor arrived in August, which was significant because the nearest one had been in Pueblo. A second general store opened. The school enrollment grew to 18 children by autumn, which meant Alma needed help, and she trained a 17-year-old girl named Clara, who had completed her own schooling in Ohio, as a teaching assistant. Durant left town in February. No one asked where he went. Sheriff Baines, Greer's brother-in-law, resigned his position in April following continued newspaper scrutiny of the county's law enforcement conflicts of interest, and was replaced by a deputy named Marsh who was, if not a remarkable man, a straightforward one who did his job without owing it to anyone. Calhoun Greer remained in Harlan Creek because he had too much invested there to leave, and his relationship with the town was now something more like a standoff than a war. He was still a powerful man. He was no longer an unchecked one, which was its own kind of resolution. He tipped his hat to Alma Aldridge Carver when he passed her on the road, and she returned the courtesy with her chin up and her spine straight, and Patrick thought that the gesture contained more dignity than anything else that had passed between those two. In the autumn of 1879, Alma told Patrick she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen of their house, on a morning in October that was almost exactly a year from the day Patrick had first walked into Harlan Creek with his salt and his pack mule and his 6 years of practiced solitude. She told him plainly, because that was how she did things, and she watched his face with that precise amber-eyed attention. He sat down. "Patrick," she said, with the particular edge in her voice that meant she was trying to read him and wasn't certain what she was reading. "I'm here," he said. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm just—" He looked up at her. "I need a moment." "Take 2," she said. He took 1. Then he stood up from the table and crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her carefully, because he was a large man and she was not a large woman, and she was suddenly, permanently precious in a way that made him want to be very careful. And he said, "Alma," against her hair. The name he could not stop saying, "Alma, that is the best thing you have ever told me, and that is a considerable distinction." She laughed into his chest, that surprised one, the one he loved best. Their son was born in June of 1880, healthy and loud and equipped with a remarkable amount of dark hair, on a warm afternoon when the school was closed for the summer, and the cottonwoods along the creek were in full leaf. They named him Samuel for no specific reason except that they both liked the name, and it seemed to suit him, which turned out to be true. Samuel Carver was a calm and curious child who was, from the earliest age, interested in everything and startled by nothing. Patrick held him on the front porch the evening of his birth and looked out at the mountains in the late light and thought about the 6 years he had lived up there in the belief that he had found the thing he needed. He had found something up there. He had found himself, or a version of himself, stripped down to what was essential. But what he had found here, in a town he had entered looking for salt, was the rest of it. The thing the mountains had been keeping him from, not protecting him from, keeping him from, which was the kind of difference that took a person some time to understand. He said Alma's name quietly to the evening, and it still had that quality it had had from the beginning, completeness, like a sentence that said everything in a single word. She came to the door behind him, moving carefully because she was newly recovered and resting, and she looked at him with Samuel in his arms and she said, "What are you thinking?" "That I came to town for salt," he said. She laughed. And I should have come down from that mountain years earlier," he said. "No," she said, coming to stand beside him, tucking herself under his free arm, looking at the mountains in the last light. "You came when you were supposed to. Both of us did. That's how it works." "Is it?" He said. "I believe so," she said. He kissed her temple. Samuel made a small sound that was neither distress nor contentment but inquiry, the sound of a person who wanted to know what was happening, which was a sound that would characterize him for the rest of his early life and would drive Alma to absolute joy because she recognized it in herself. The years moved as years do in frontier towns, not quickly but with substance, filling themselves with events and seasons, and the small accumulated texture of a life lived by people who had chosen to be fully present in it. Marisol Torres, who had stood in the front row of Alma's schoolroom reading whole sentences at age 8, with the focus of someone who understood that knowledge was portable and permanent, continued to grow and learn with an appetite that nothing in Harlan Creek could fully contain. By 14, she was reading medical texts that the doctor, a man named Ellison who had arrived in 1879, lent her from his own collection. By 16, she was translating for him in consultations with Spanish-speaking patients and asking questions about treatment that he found genuinely interesting. He began, quietly and informally, to teach her. Not because he was required to, but because the alternative was to watch something remarkable go to waste, and he was not that kind of man. Alma fought for Marisol the same way Marisol's own education had been fought for. She wrote letters on Marisol's behalf to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania, which had been accepting female students since 1850, and to the University of Michigan Medical School, which had admitted women since 1870. She gathered recommendations from Dr. Ellison, and from 2 professors she contacted by letter after learning of their work. She helped Marisol prepare her application, which was written in English so precise and clear that it read like someone who had been practicing language as a serious discipline since the age of 8, which was true. Marisol was accepted in 1888, when she was 18 years old, to the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. Her father Diego held the letter in his large calloused hands for a long time, and Patrick, who was present when it arrived, watched a man try very hard to be composed and fail in the most completely human way, and did not say anything because some things did not need words. Marisol left for Philadelphia in September of 1888. The school let out early that day so the children could wave her off at the stage, which Alma organized without telling anyone it had been her idea, because she was always doing things that were her idea while making other people feel they had thought of them. Marisol embraced Alma at the stage and said, "You are the reason," and Alma held her for a long moment and said, "You are the reason. I just opened the door." Patrick stood beside them and felt something that had nothing complicated in it at all. Samuel was 8 by then, old enough to understand that something significant was happening, and he watched Marisol go with his father's particular quality of attention, taking in information to be examined later. He had his mother's coloring and his father's height already, and his mother's exactness of thought and his father's patience. And he was, by universal assessment, a good child, which is something parents rarely know how to take credit for, but which is usually the result of being raised by people who treated each other and the world with consistent decency. Alma became pregnant again in 1882, and again in 1885, and again in 1888. Their second child was a girl they named Ruth, who from the age of 2 had opinions about everything and the volume to express them, and who grew up to be a woman of considerable and somewhat alarming confidence. Their third child was another boy, named Daniel, who was quieter than either of his siblings, and who spent his early years mostly in the company of a stray cat named General that he had brought home from the creek one afternoon without asking anyone's permission, on the grounds that the cat was wet and cold, and needed to be somewhere dry and warm, which was an argument Patrick found it impossible to refute, because he had once had exactly the same reasoning applied to him. Their fourth child, born in 1888 in the same autumn Marisol left for Philadelphia, was a girl they named Clara, after the young teaching assistant who had helped Alma in the school, because Clara herself had by then moved to Denver with her husband, and Alma missed her, and naming a daughter was a perfectly acceptable way of saying so. The house on the east side of Harlan Creek had grown by 1888 to 5 rooms, and a covered porch all the way around 3 sides, which Patrick had built season by season, adding to it as the family grew, the same way he had built his mountain cabin. With timber he selected himself and work he understood in his hands before he completed it in wood. On evenings when the children were in bed, and the town was quiet, and the mountain stars were visible from the porch, Patrick and Alma sat together in the particular silence that belonged to people who had spent enough time in each other's company to be comfortable in quiet without filling it. He had his arm around her, and she was leaning against him, and sometimes one of them read aloud, and sometimes they just sat. And the name he had been saying inside himself since the first October afternoon, he had seen her come out of the sheriff's office with her chin up, and her spine straight was still there, still warm, still insistent. "You're thinking loudly," she said one evening, which was a thing she said when she could feel his thoughts gathering, which happened more often than he could explain. "I'm thinking about salt," he said. She turned her head to look at him. "Salt. I came down from that mountain for 50 pounds of salt," he said, "which is a very small thing." She said, with the quality of someone waiting to see where this was going. "And what I got," he said, "was a life I could not have built up there, could not have imagined. Children and a house and a town and you." He was quiet for a moment. "I was so certain up there, about what I needed, about who I was wrong about the shape of it." She was quiet beside him, listening. "I was right that I needed honesty," he said. "I was right that I needed something true. I was wrong about where to find it." She took his hand. "Where did you find it?" He looked at her. "In a woman who didn't cry when she had every reason to," he said. "Who told the sheriff the law would have to get used to disappointment. Who stayed for 12 children in a school that everyone was telling her to abandon." He paused. "In a woman whose name I said out loud in the middle of a road, and could not stop saying afterward." Alma Aldridge Carver looked at him for a long moment with those dark amber eyes that still had the quality of measurement in them. But the measurement now was the warm kind, the kind that had already tallied everything and found the sum entirely sufficient. She put her hand against his jaw, as she had done that evening in October 2 years into their knowing each other, and she said, "Patrick Carver, yes, you are a surprisingly romantic man for someone who spent 6 years alone on a mountain." "The mountain gave me a lot of time to think," he said. "About what?" "Turns out," he said, "I was thinking about you. I just didn't know it yet." She laughed, the surprised one, his favorite, the one that had been escaping her since that first evening in the boarding-house parlor, and she tucked herself more completely against him. And the mountain was there in the distance, dark and certain and present, and the town was around them, lit and living, and his family was inside the house behind them. 4 children and 1 cat named General, and a life built piece by piece from the decision to stay. In 1890, Harlan Creek received its official township charter from the state of Colorado, which had been a state since 1876, and with the charter came a proper municipal structure and an elected town council that replaced the informal one that had been operating since the town's founding. Patrick Carver was elected to that council without campaigning for it, on the strength of 12 years of simply being there, and being the kind of man who did what he said, and said what he thought. He served on it for 2 terms, and then declined a third, because Samuel was 15 and beginning to talk about going east to study engineering, and Patrick wanted to be present for the years of that. The school had grown by 1890 to 34 students and 3 teachers, Alma chief among them, and had added a second building that Patrick had helped design and build. The curriculum had expanded under Alma's direction to include natural history, basic arithmetic through algebra, and of course she had developed herself on the history of the West that was notable for including the perspectives of people who were rarely in the history books, the Spanish settlers, the indigenous peoples, the Mexican miners, the Chinese laborers who had come through with the railroad. She taught it with the same conviction she taught everything. This is what is real, this is what happened, and your job is to understand it clearly. some parents had objected early on to the breadth of the curriculum. Alma had listened to their objections with complete courtesy and changed nothing, because she had been educated in the school of Calhoun Greer, and she knew the difference between feedback that came from genuine concern and pressure that came from discomfort with uncomfortable truths. And she was not in the business of making people comfortable at the expense of making children informed. Patrick had, on one such occasion, sat beside her at a public meeting while she made this case, and he had not said a word, because she did not need him to. But afterward she had said to him, "You being there helped," and he had said, "I know." And she had looked at him with a quality that was neither surprised nor grateful exactly, but something warmer and more specific than either. Marisol Tours returned to Harlan Creek in 1892 as Dr. Marisol Tours, which was a title she bore with the same composed practicality she had brought to translating at the assay office at age 8. She joined Dr. Ellison's practice and within 2 years was handling the majority of the obstetric work in the valley, which was significant because women in frontier communities often preferred a woman doctor for such matters, and had previously had no choice in the question. Her father Diego, who had grown old in the years of her absence, met her at the stage when she returned, and this time Patrick was not the only one who had to look away to give the moment its privacy. Marisol's return was the kind of thing that Alma cried about, privately in the kitchen the evening before, because she had been so invested in it for so long and the waiting had been a form of its own tension. And Patrick found her there and did not say anything about the crying because she was entitled to it, and he simply stood with her until she was done. "She did it," Alma said. "She did," he said. "We did right by her," Alma said, which was not something she said often about her own actions, because she was not a woman who congratulated herself, but on this occasion she allowed it. "Yes," Patrick said, "we did." Samuel left for the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1893, at 18, which was the year the institute had finally established an engineering program that Patrick judged worth the distance. Putting his son on a train east was the most complicated experience Patrick had had since the first winter on the mountain, because Samuel was his own person in a way Patrick deeply respected, and also because Samuel was his child in a way that did not submit to reason, and the distance between those two facts was one a parent simply had to live in. Alma stood on the station platform with her hand in Patrick's and watched the train diminish into the eastern distance and then said, "He'll be fine." "He's ours." "He's himself," Patrick corrected. "He's ours," she repeated, "and he's himself, which is not a contradiction." Patrick put his arm around her and they stood there until the train was gone, and then they walked back to the house where Ruth was 14 and furious about something, and Daniel was 11 and philosophical about everything, and Clara was 6 and had recently discovered that shouting was a very effective way of communicating and was testing this hypothesis extensively. Life was loud. Life was full. It was nothing like the mountain, and it was everything like what the mountain had been preparing him for, though he had not known that until he was in the middle of it. In 1895, Patrick Carver was 51 years old and Alma was 43, and they had been married for 16 years, and he still said her name with the same quality he had said it the first time in the middle of a dirt road, not identically. The shock was gone. The strangeness was gone, but the fullness remained. The sense of a word that contained something complete, and she knew it, had always known it, because she was a woman who paid attention to things. On a Sunday in late October, which was the time of year that always returned them to their beginning, Alma closed the school at noon and met Patrick at the edge of town, where he had their horses saddled and a pack with provisions, and they rode out together, just the two of them, northwest into the foothills that lifted toward the high country. They did not go all the way to the ridge. They went far enough that the town was small below them, and the sky was enormous above them, and the air had that particular quality of the high Colorado autumn, knife-edge and crystalline, the kind that made everything visible for miles and miles. They stopped on a ledge that looked both down at the valley and up at the peaks, which was not the place Patrick had lived but was close enough to it that he knew the smell of the air, the quality of the light, the specific way the wind came off the upper snowfields. Alma sat beside him on a flat rock, their horses picketed nearby, and looked at the view with the same quality she looked at everything, not as scenery but as fact. "Do you miss it?" she asked. He looked at the peaks. Thought about it honestly as he did everything. "The clarity," he said, "not the aloneness, the clarity. Can you have one without the other?" "I have you," he said, "which is the clearest thing I know." She looked at him sidelong with that small compression of her lips that meant she was moved and was allowing herself to be. "You are remarkably good at that," she said, "saying true things that also happen to be the most affecting things you could possibly say." "I'm not doing it on purpose," he said. "I know," she said. "That's exactly why it works." He laughed. She laughed. They sat on the ledge in the high country air with the valley below them and the peaks above them, and 16 years of a life made together between them like a country. They had both learned the language of completely, so that neither had to translate anymore. She took his hand. He held it. They rode back down as the afternoon light turned gold, which in the Sangre de Cristos in October is a specific kind of gold that exists nowhere else in the world. A warm and serious color that makes everything it touches look significant. And the town appeared below them with its lights coming on in the early dusk. Their house on the east side with the porch all the way around. Their children and one elderly but still opinionated cat. Their school and their neighbors and the life they had made from the decision to stay, from the chance of salt, from a name said out loud in the middle of a road that could not be unsaid, and could never, after that, be unfelt. Samuel returned from Boston at 22, an engineer with a particular specialty in irrigation systems, which turned out to be one of the most practically useful skills a person could have in the arid West. And he settled in Denver, but came home to Harlan Creek for every Christmas without exception, bringing eventually a woman named Grace who was a librarian, and who became one of the great joys of Alma's later life. Because a librarian was exactly the kind of daughter-in-law Alma Aldridge had been built to adore. Ruth went east herself at 20 to study law, which in 1896 was not a simple thing for a woman to do, but which Ruth approached with the particular confidence of someone who had been raised by Alma Aldridge, and therefore regarded obstacles as logistical problems rather than verdicts. She became, in time, a practicing attorney in Denver, one of a very small number of women in that profession in the state, and she was ferociously good at it, and Patrick told her this directly, which she accepted as her due because she was Ruth. Daniel stayed close to home. He married a quiet rancher's daughter named Esperanza, who had the same philosophical temperament he did, and they ran a small cattle operation in the valley just north of Harlan Creek, and their house was always warm and their door was always open, and their children were numerous and relaxed. Clara, the youngest, became a teacher like her mother, which surprised no one. She eventually took over Alma's role at the Harlan Creek School when Alma retired in 1905, and she ran it with a combination of her mother's precision and her own considerably more theatrical personality, and the children adored her. Patrick lived to be 78 years old. He died in the house he had built on the east side of Harlan Creek in the spring of 1922, with Alma beside him and Samuel and Daniel in the house, and Ruth on her way from Denver and Clara downstairs, making coffee the way she always did when she did not know what else to do with her hands. He had been ill for 3 weeks, which was enough time for everything important to be said, which he said to each of his children in the specific and particular way that their father spoke, without flourish, with complete precision, meaning every word because he had chosen each one. To Alma, on the last evening, he said what he had always said when the lights were out and the night was quiet. He said her name, She was 70 years old, and her brown hair was white now, and her amber eyes were the same as they had ever been, and she held his hand and she said, "I'm here." "I know," he said. "You've been here since October of 1878. You walked into my path and refused to move," she said. "I moved," he said. "And then you stayed," she said. "And then I stayed," he agreed. The window of the bedroom faced east, toward the mountains, and in the early spring morning the peaks were visible in the first clear light, and Patrick Carver, who had come down from those mountains 34 years ago for 50 pounds of salt and had stayed for every single other reason that mattered, held his wife's hand and looked at what he had built, not the house, the life, and thought that it was more than enough. It was everything. Alma Aldridge Carver lived for another 14 years after Patrick, and she spent those years the way she spent all years, with complete attention. She wrote a history of Harlan Creek's first school that was eventually used as a reference document by the Colorado State Historical Society. She corresponded regularly with Marisol Tours, who by then was Dr. Marisol Tours, and was training a second generation of medical students in the practical realities of frontier medicine. She read everything she could obtain. She sat on the east porch of the house in the evenings and looked at the mountains and said his name sometimes, quietly, to herself, because she had learned from experience that it was a name that did not require the person to be present in order to be full. On the morning she died in 1936, which was a long way from 1878 but not as far as it sounds when you have lived inside it, Clara was there, and several grandchildren, and a great-grandchild who was 3 years old and who would grow up knowing only the story. But the story was the real thing. The story was that a man had come down from a mountain for salt and had found instead a reason, a complete and total reason, in the form of a woman who did not cry when she had every right to, and who told the law it would have to get used to disappointment, and who built a school and kept it, and changed what 12 children and then 34 children knew about the world and what they might become in it. The story was that he had said her name in the middle of a road and had never been able to stop. The story was that she had asked him directly if he was staying for some other reason, and he had told the truth, and she had told hers, and they had built something between them that survived season and storm and the accumulated weight of years, and was still standing long after both of them were gone, in the school that bore Alma Aldridge Carver's name on a small bronze plaque that Clara arranged to have installed in 1923. And in the children who had grown into doctors and lawyers and engineers and teachers and ranchers and parents, all of them carrying the thing Alma had believed was the most portable kind of property, the thing no one could foreclose on or repossess or burn down. What was in your head? What was in your heart? A name you came down from a mountain saying and could not, would not, did not ever stop.